This One's Wife. A fly on the wall in Monetcito. Part 1. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. One of the huge advantages that you have as a consequence of access to my work is that not only are you hugely entertained as a consequence of my pithy observations, sarcastic humour, and own brand of snark, you're informed about narcissism and psychopathy. And I would encourage those of you who generally only watch my videos for This One's Wife to ensure that you try out my other videos across other celebrities and other facets of narcissism and psychopathy. You will be richly rewarded, and you can thank me later. My insight into the mind and activities of This One's Wife is unrivaled. I was the first to publicly describe her as a narcissist and explain what that means. And as a consequence of that, I am able to explain to you what is going on behind those closed doors, in those secret meetings, how she reacts to news that breaks about, for instance, things that the one that got away, William, and the nemesis, Kate, are up to. What she thinks or doesn't think with regard to her father, where she is in the dynamic with Harry, and as part of that, I'm able to provide you with information which has essentially been downloaded from a fly on the wall that has been occupying the walls at Montecito and elsewhere to garner what's really been going on with This One's Wife. There's a substantial amount of material to get through, and therefore I'd encourage you to make yourself comfortable, possibly ensure that your mouth is free of beverage or food, so as you don't splatter it all over your screen or choke on the Eccles cake that you might be eating, and that you strap yourself in to be both informed and entertained as I share with you the contents of what the fly on the wall has learned in the last year. Winter 2022. We've been reflecting quietly for a few months on how awesome we are, explains Prince Harry, and yet how cruelly misunderstood. We're humanitarians, I yell at the chickens only this morning. It is in the very DNA of our foundation, because Archwell is from the Greek word for arches, wellness. The chickens only look at me and cluck. They are chickens, says the gardener, who is wise, and they cluck. You are wise, I tell him, and he nods and passes me the spliff. Later, a call comes through from the PR guy. Great news, he says. You've been nominated for an award. It's for being awesome, but misunderstood. Really? I say. No, he says. You're being honored for addressing injustices. Wonderful, I say. Have we? Yes, says Meg, but please understand that everything we do isn't about us. She tells the PR guy, we're not in this for awards. It's about living a life of service. Really? Says the PR guy. Kind of, says Meg. It's an amazing new form of self-service. And did I mention our boundless respect and deference for the late Queen? You didn't, he says, but I already knew. And the new Queen? Not so much, adds This One's Wife. Spring 2023. So I think the plan is we fly to New York, pick up our award, and then go home. Are you kidding me? Boring, says This One's Wife, but with love. We need to make a splash. She snaps her fingers, and the PR guy comes on speakerphone and says, how about a visit to a school in a deprived area where this one's wife can read her children's book, The Bench. This one's wife says, "That's a terrific idea. Let's bat this around a little." She's thinking soft, berry-coloured separates, children sitting cross-legged on the floor gazing up at her raptly. The PR guy nods and says he's thinking neutral soft furnishings with taupe accents to complement the berry shades, fresh flowers, and a single spotlight on this one's wife. "And I'm thinking 5-year-old kids would be the optimal size," he adds. "Any younger, and they're too short. Any taller, they might get in the way." "And the school?" I ask. "The area, the levels of deprivation of the kids, what's it all like?" "A little primary coloured at the moment," says the PR guy. "Blues and reds and really harsh yellow on the doors, but we can fix that." "I love your can-do attitude," says this one's wife. Meeting with the press release woman ahead of the trip. "So we've been thinking," she says, "people of your calibre don't just read books aloud to children. That's not an accurate reflection of how serious and substantial you are." This one's wife writes serious and substantial in her notebook and asks what she suggests. "How about this?" the press release woman says. "You're not reading a picture book, you're showcasing community support for the arts. And in any case, any journalists get the wrong idea and think you're just reading aloud to some school kids, we won't invite them. And if the teachers and kids get the wrong idea, we'll make them sign NDAs." We could do that," I say admiringly. "We can do anything," she says. Our gagging order." "But if the press aren't there," says this one's wife, "how will we get any press? Because if we don't, what's the point?" "Service?" I say, but nobody hears me. "You deserve always to be reported with reverence and respect," says the press release woman, "and yet a free press can make this difficult to achieve. So we thought about—" "Oh, censorship!" I cry. "Brilliant! I can't believe those losers at Buckingham Palace never thought of that. God bless America and its can-do spirit." The press release woman looks at this one's wife, who pats my arm and says, "Hush, honey. That's not quite what she meant." "We've invited Oprah and Vogue," finishes the PR woman, "and we all agree that journalistically that covers all the bases." "Oh, at least until we can get this censorship thing off the ground," I say. This one's wife's pretending to write an oat milk investment strategy, but is secretly looking at the coverage of Willie and Kate taking the children to church on Easter Sunday. She says, "Such attention seekers. Who do they think they are? And leveraging their royal links by using their children. Pathetic." "Isn't that why you called your daughter a Lilibet?" says the comms guy who lives in the porch for our convenience, but realistically not for much longer. As soon as he says it, he clamps his hand over his mouth. "I didn't mean to say that out loud," he says. No problem," I say. "I can see why you might think that, but it's actually very different. We call her Lilibet out of an excess of respect and deference for my late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth." "And by the way, you're fired," says this one's wife. "Vacate the porch with immediate effect." She points to the door, but with love, because that's just who she is. "Why are we so misunderstood?" I ask, and she shrugs and turns back to the oat milk investment strategy. Omid's popped in to say he's writing a new book about how the royal family is doomed. "Doomed without me?" says this one's wife, "or just doomed more generally?" Omid says, "Both." And this one's wife pounts. "Oh, but mostly without you," he says, and she smiles. "How do you know?" I ask. He says something about working for Harper's Bazaar, which doesn't seem to explain it at all, but this one's wife says, "Don't overthink it, honey." Anyway, Omid wants to know if we'd like to tell him anything about the doomed royal family and how beastly they are. "Anything at all," he says helpfully, "however beastly." "We couldn't possibly give quotes to a journalist," I say, "because they can't be relied on to write about us with reverence and respect." Omid says, "Oh, but we can rely on him." "No," I say, "I'm sorry, but it's out of the question. And by the way, how did you know all that stuff in Finding Freedom that happened when it was just this one's wife and me behind closed doors? Omid looks at this one's wife, and this one's wife looks at me strangely and starts scribbling notes, which he passes to the comms guy, who passes them to Omid, who says, "Thank you." "Look," says this one's wife with a dazzling smile, "no hands." Omid says his book will start with an intimate behind-the-scenes look at my grandmother's final days, and I start to feel a feeling that I think might be confusion. I make a note to ask my therapist. "Oh, sounds amazing," I say. "Except you weren't there, were you? Either behind the scenes, or a curtain, or anywhere. Were you?" Omid says of course not. He's just some guy who used to work for Harper's Bazaar, and maybe still does. And am I questioning his truth? I recoil and say, "Whoa, no, I would never do that. Truth is truth, even when it isn't, and maybe especially when it isn't." "And what's the best truth of all?" says this one's wife with an encouraging smile. Half-truth?" I say, and she shakes her head. Post-truth?" And she says, "No, honey, try again." "Oh, I know, our-truth," I shout triumphantly, and she pats my arm. Meg tells Omid that the world has been waiting for an important book like this, and he must tell us more. He says that Chapter 2 is called Shaky Ground, the Queen is dead and the monarchy faces trouble. This one's wife claps her hands delightedly and says, "What an incredible achievement." Almost none of that sentence is true, and all her favourite stories about the royal family are the ones that aren't true. "The ground was never shaky, and the monarchy was never in trouble," she says. "You are a genius." Omid smiles humbly. Chapter 3, he says, will focus with laser-like intensity, and yet also compassion, on our humanitarian ventures and philanthropic aims. "Oh, out of interest," I ask, "do you talk like this all the time?" He shrugs and says it's a skill. "Also," I say to Harry's wife this later on as we get ready for bed, remind me what the human word means." She rolls her eyes, but with love, and hands me a copy of my English for Dummies. I get into bed, punch the cushion with Willie's face on like I do every night, and settle down to read. Not long after we announce that we haven't received an invitation to Pa's coronation, this one's wife says that we actually have, but the PR people thought that didn't sit well with our narrative. "It's time for us to own our truth," she says, "or in this case, deny their truth, which is that they sent us an invitation and we didn't get it. Or maybe we did, but too late. Whatever. Details are for the little people," she says, snapping her fingers for the comms guy, who runs in from the porch holding a half-eaten ham sandwich. This one wife stares at it. "Comms," she says, "in the house? Really not cool." The comms guy lobs it over his shoulder where it hits the gardener on the head. "We need to control the narrative, the coronation narrative, and take it to the next stage," says this one's wife. The comms guy says that controlling the coronation narrative is ambitious, but possibly undeliverable, what with our having no control over it at all. This one's wife tells him that his role is to be a positive solutions person. "Oh, out of interest," I ask this one's wife, because I've been wondering this for a while and it's given me a headache. "What is our narrative?" "No, wait." I get my notebook out of my pocket and start a feeling which I think might now be anxiety. Let's start with, what narrative actually means, because our PR people use that word a lot. This one's wife yells for someone to bring my juggling balls to help calm me, but the guy takes ages, so she thumps him on the arm, but with love, and says, "Final warning." It's weird, those unfounded bullying allegations. You only have to look at her to know they weren't true. How could someone so hot ever be horrid? So this one's wife has decided I'll be going to the coronation on my own, because no one has been able to give any guarantees that any of the spotlight will be on her at any stage, even if she's carried away by the emotion and spectacle and sheds a single perfect tear. "Oh, shocking, my love," I tell her. "No reverence, no respect." She looks sad but stoic, and also hot. I call the palace to ask the King's private secretary, Clive, where I can stay while I'm there. We're just finalising that, he says. But let's just say, bring a sleeping bag and realistically a tent too, and bear in mind that the pavement on Whitehall is convenient for the Abbey, and particularly spacious. Thus, you have learned much of what has been going on, truly, in the past year in Montecito and its environs. But we move on now to Coronation Day and what that brings also in part 2. Join me there.